Picture a castle so imposing, so visually overwhelming, that entire armies would alter their campaign routes just to avoid its shadow. A fortress whose walls were never scarred by catapult stones, whose gates were never tested by battering rams, yet whose influence shaped borders and decided conflicts without a single drop of blood being spilled. This is the world of forgotten strongholds, architectural titans, built not for battle, but for psychological warfare. These stone sentinels were designed with one brilliant purpose: to project such an aura of invincibility that no enemy would dare challenge them. They represent one of history's most fascinating and overlooked strategies, the art of winning wars without ever fighting them. We often imagine medieval warfare as a constant clash of steel and fire, with castles serving as stages for epic sieges and heroic last stands. But the truth is far more intriguing. Some of the most strategically brilliant fortresses never saw combat at all. Their power lay not in their ability to withstand attack, but in their capacity to prevent attack altogether. Through sheer architectural intimidation, clever positioning, and carefully cultivated reputations, these structures became the ultimate deterrents, peacekeepers in stone, that maintained stability across entire regions for generations. They stand as testaments to a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that medieval rulers mastered centuries before modern military strategists would formalize the concept of deterrence theory. In this journey through time, we'll explore these magnificent forgotten fortresses that history books often overlook precisely because they were too successful to attract dramatic stories of siege and conquest. We'll uncover how medieval architects used shadow, scale, and strategic placement to create illusions of impregnability. We'll examine how rumors were weaponized, how appearances were carefully maintained, and how the mere suggestion of strength could be more powerful than strength itself. From the mathematically perfect castles of France to the coastal guardians of Scandinavia, we'll discover how stone and strategy combined to create peace through fear, and how these silent sentinels shaped the course of history without ever drawing their swords. This is the untold story of fortresses that won their wars before they even began. Medieval rulers grasped a fundamental truth about power that remains relevant today. The most decisive victories are often won not on the battlefield, but in the minds of your opponents. They recognized that a fortress's greatest strength could be its ability to psychologically paralyze an enemy before a single arrow was ever nocked. This wasn't merely about building strong walls. It was about crafting an illusion of absolute, unassailable power. The strategic placement of a castle was the first chapter in this story of intimidation. By perching these structures on jagged cliffs, steep hills, or surrounded by treacherous water, architects used the natural landscape as a force multiplier. An approaching army would first have to contend with the exhausting climb or dangerous approach, their morale sinking with every difficult step as the fortress loomed larger and more impossible above them. This calculated intimidation extended to every visible detail. The sheer vertical scale of the walls was designed to make men feel small and vulnerable. The choice of stone mattered immensely. Lighter limestone might be used for lower sections, with darker, more ominous basalt or granite rising above, creating a visual effect that made the battlements appear even higher and more foreboding against the sky. The strategic placement of towers wasn't just for defensive angles. It created a complex, jagged silhouette that looked impenetrable from any direction. The main gatehouse was rarely a simple door. It was a deep, dark tunnel punctuated by multiple portcullises and murder holes, a terrifying passage that any sensible soldier would be desperate to avoid. From a distance, these features combined to send an unambiguous message. Assault is futile, but the architecture was only part of the strategy. Medieval lords were masters of information warfare, centuries before the term was ever coined. They understood that perception could be manipulated and that a rumor could be as effective as a regiment of knights. Spies and traveling merchants were deliberately fed exaggerated tales of bottomless granaries, vast underground reservoirs, and secret armories stocked with enough weapons to equip a phantom army. Whispers of the garrison's size would be inflated, their skill and ferocity mythologized in taverns and market squares until the stories reached the ears of rival commanders. This created a powerful feedback loop. The imposing castle fueled the rumors, and the rumors, in turn, enhanced the castle's fearsome reputation. This strategic deception transformed stone and mortar into a psychological weapon, making these fortresses not just buildings, but active participants in a silent war of nerves that kept the peace for generations. Every element of these formidable structures was meticulously crafted to send a clear, chilling message to any would-be attacker: turn back or face certain destruction. The most immediately striking feature was always the curtain wall, those immense, seemingly endless barriers of stone that wrapped the fortress in a protective shell. Builders didn't just aim for height, they sought to create an optical illusion of scale. By using alternating bands of light and dark stone, they crafted visual patterns that tricked the eye, making the walls appear to stretch even higher into the sky than they actually did. From the perspective of an approaching soldier, these towering barriers felt less like a man-made construction and more like an impassable cliff face, a natural obstacle that defied human assault. At the base of these walls, another ingenious feature awaited: the glacis. This was not a simple, gentle slope, but an artfully designed, impossibly steep earthen ramp or stone-faced incline that surrounded the fortress foundations. Its purpose was brutally practical. It prevented siege towers from being rolled directly against the walls, as their wheels would simply sink into the loose earth or fail to gain traction on the smooth, angled stone. For infantry attempting a direct assault, the glacis transformed a charge into a clumsy, vulnerable scramble. Soldiers would be forced to climb this exposed slope on their hands and knees, utterly defenseless against the arrows, rocks, and boiling liquids that would inevitably rain down upon them from above. The very design of the approach spelled out a grim probability: death before even reaching the wall. Perhaps the most psychologically daunting element was the gatehouse. Far from being a simple entrance, it was a masterclass in controlled terror. A dark, tunnel-like passage designed as a series of lethal choke points. An attacker brave or foolish enough to approach the main gate would first have to contend with a raised iron portcullis, its sharpened points hovering ominously overhead. Once inside the narrow passage, they would find themselves in a cramped, shadowy space, with multiple more portcullises ahead and behind. Then came the murder holes, openings in the ceiling through which defenders could pour sand to blind and disorient, drop heavy stones to crush helmets and bones, or unleash boiling water or hot oil to inflict horrific burns. Arrow slits were strategically positioned to allow defenders to fire laterally down the length of the passage, meaning anyone trapped inside was caught in a deadly crossfire with nowhere to hide. This wasn't an entrance, it was a carefully engineered death trap. The strategic placement of towers completed this symphony of defensive intimidation. Rather than being spaced evenly or placed for symmetry, towers were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. This meant that any attacker attempting to focus on one section of wall would immediately find themselves exposed to projectiles and arrows from multiple directions simultaneously. There was no safe angle of approach, no blind spot to exploit. The constant, threatening presence of these projecting towers created a psychological landscape of perpetual vulnerability for any army considering an assault. Every potential approach vector was covered, every strategy seemingly anticipated. This architectural genius sent an unmistakable message of invincibility, making the very idea of attack seem not just difficult but fundamentally futile. These design elements, working in concert, created fortresses that were less buildings and more psychological weapons, a reality we can see clearly when we examine our first extraordinary example. Rising from the forests of northern France like something from a fairy tale, the Château de Pierrefonds presents a masterclass in architectural intimidation. Its story begins not with a famous siege or a legendary battle, but with a profound and lasting peace enforced by its sheer presence. Originally constructed in the 12th century, its true transformation into an unconquerable symbol of power came under the direction of Louis d'Orléans in the late 1300s. This was a period of immense turmoil in France, with rival noble factions constantly jockeying for power and territory. In this climate of uncertainty, Louis didn't just want a strong castle. He needed a statement, a declaration in stone that his lands were utterly off-limits. The most immediate aspect of that statement was its scale. Pyrophons is not a modest fort. It is a sprawling complex of stone engineered to dominate the landscape visually. Its 8 massive towers, each crowned with witch-hat roofs, create a jagged, formidable skyline that can be seen for miles. But the real genius lies in its double enceinte, a set of 2 complete, independent defensive walls encircling the castle. An attacker who miraculously breached the formidable outer wall would not find themselves in the courtyard, but trapped in a deadly killing zone between the outer and even higher inner wall, exposed to fire from all sides. This design didn't just add a layer of defense, it communicated a message of infinite redundancy, suggesting that for every wall broken, another stronger one waited behind it. Beyond the imposing walls, Pierrefonds showcased cutting-edge military technology that made it appear generations ahead of its time. At the dawn of the 15th century, cannons were beginning to change the face of warfare, rendering many older, square-towered castles obsolete. The architects of Pierrefonds responded not with fear but with innovation. They constructed vast, rounded towers. This curvature was a brilliant tactical adaptation, as rounded surfaces are far more effective at deflecting cannonballs than flat walls, causing the projectiles to glance off harmlessly. For any army commander observing the castle from a distance, these smooth, modern towers sent a clear signal: your newfangled siege weapons are useless here. We have already evolved beyond them. Historical accounts from the region confirm that the psychological strategy worked perfectly. Military campaigns and raiding parties led by rival lords and even foreign armies consistently charted a wide path around the territory controlled by Pierrefonds. The calculus was simple. Why waste months of time, enormous resources, and hundreds of lives in a dubious assault on this titan of stone when softer targets were available elsewhere? The castle's garrison, though skilled, never had to prove its mettle in a prolonged defense. The building itself did all the fighting through the fear it instilled in the hearts of potential adversaries. It controlled the economic and political life of the entire region without a single arrow being loosed from its battlements, becoming the ultimate embodiment of a timeless strategic principle: the best victory is the one you don't have to fight for. Perched high in the mountains of modern-day Syria, Krak Deschevaliers stands as perhaps the most iconic Crusader castle ever built, a monument to the sheer psychological power of perfect design. Its story is unique among great fortresses. Its ultimate capture came not through force of arms, but through deception, precisely because its physical defenses were considered so overwhelming that a direct assault was deemed unthinkable by generations of military commanders. What made this fortress so fearsome was its revolutionary concentric design, a concept so advanced for its time it must have appeared almost supernatural to opposing forces. Imagine not one, but two complete, independent rings of towering stone walls, one nestled inside the other. An attacking army that somehow overcame the immense outer wall would not find victory, but instead would be trapped in a nightmarish killing zone, completely exposed to arrows, rocks, and boiling liquid raining down from the even higher inner wall that loomed above them. This wasn't just a castle, it was a mathematical equation for certain death, a puzzle with no solution. Its strategic positioning amplified this intimidating presence to an almost absurd degree. Built atop a 650-meter-high ridge known as the Horns of Hammer, Krak Deschevaliers enjoyed a commanding view of the entire surrounding region. From its battlements, lookouts could spot dust clouds from marching armies days before they arrived, giving the garrison ample time to prepare and sending a clear message to any approaching force: "We see you coming and we are ready." This unparalleled visibility eliminated the possibility of surprise, forcing any potential attacker to march for days under the psychological weight of knowing they were being watched and measured by an unseen enemy high above. The approach itself was a grueling, uphill trek that would exhaust soldiers and drain their morale long before they ever got within bowshot of the mighty walls. The castle's reputation transcended its physical form, evolving into a legend that was carefully cultivated and spread throughout the Islamic world. Arab chroniclers of the era wrote about Krak Deschevaliers with a mixture of dread and reverence. The famous Muslim historian Ibn al-Athir himself referred to it as the bone in the throat of the Muslims. Other accounts, likely embellished by design, claimed the fortress could be held by a mere handful of knights against thousands, its defenses so superior that numbers were irrelevant. This fearsome reputation became a weapon in itself. For over a century, Muslim armies, including those led by brilliant strategists like Saladin, looked upon the fortress and consistently chose to bypass it entirely. They would raid other areas, attack weaker strongholds, but they would not test the legend of Krak. The cost in time, resources, and lives was calculated to be too high, the probability of success too vanishingly small. They preferred to wait for a moment of weakness, for a trick or an opportunity, rather than challenge its stone might directly. This enduring lesson in psychological deterrence, that a reputation for strength can be as formidable as strength itself, sets the stage perfectly for understanding how a fortress's location could be its greatest asset. While the walls and towers were masterpieces of intimidating design, their psychological power was dramatically amplified by something architects could not build from scratch: the very land upon which they stood. The strategic placement of a fortress was a calculated decision that turned the surrounding geography into a silent, formidable ally. Building upon a commanding high point was the most obvious advantage, but the true genius lay in choosing sites that manipulated an approaching army's every movement, channeling them into positions of fatal vulnerability. A castle positioned at the narrow neck of a mountain pass, for instance, forced a vast invading force to compress into a thin, struggling column, utterly unable to deploy its numerical superiority. The defenders, looking down from their secure heights, would see not an overwhelming horde, but a slow-moving file of exhausted men, presenting a perfect target for archers and artillery. The geography did the work of 1,000 soldiers before a single weapon was even fired. This principle is spectacularly illustrated by the castle of the Moors in Sintra, Portugal. It doesn't so much occupy the mountain as become an extension of it. Its crumbling stone walls follow the jagged, irregular spine of the granite peaks, creating a silhouette that is almost organic, as if the mountain itself had grown defensive battlements. From the valley below, the distinction between natural rock and man-made masonry blurs, presenting a vision of primal, ancient power. For a medieval commander, assessing this fortress meant confronting an impossible tactical puzzle. There was no flat ground to assemble siege engines, no clear path for a cavalry charge, and the steep, rocky slopes would break the formation of any advancing infantry long before they reached the walls. The castle appeared not just fortified, but utterly fused with an unconquerable landscape, making the idea of an assault feel less like a military operation and more like a futile struggle against nature itself. Conversely, other fortresses used isolation as their primary weapon, and few did so more dramatically than Mont Saint-Michel off the coast of Normandy. This breathtaking island abbey is a study in defensive psychology through environmental manipulation. For most of the day, it is surrounded by vast, exposed sands, seemingly accessible to anyone willing to make the trek. But this was a deadly illusion. The tide in this region is among the fastest and most powerful in Europe, racing inland at the speed of a galloping horse and cutting off the island completely twice daily. An attacking army that miscalculated its timing would not merely be delayed, it would be drowned. This natural phenomenon transformed the fortress into a moving target, secure behind its watery moat for hours at a time. Any siege would be a logistical nightmare, as the besieging army would be forced to retreat to the mainland with each incoming tide, unable to maintain constant pressure or securely position their equipment. The environment itself became a relentless, unpredictable guardian. Beyond the immediate tactical nightmare of the approach, commanders had to grapple with an even more daunting long-term problem: logistics. Supplying a medieval siege army was a colossal undertaking, requiring a constant stream of food, fodder for animals, fresh water, and ammunition stretching back along vulnerable supply lines. A fortress built in a remote, mountainous region or on a distant island like Mont Saint-Michel exacerbated this problem exponentially. Every loaf of bread and every arrow had to be transported over difficult, dangerous terrain, often through territory that might still be hostile. The further an army stretched its supply lines, the more susceptible it became to raids, bad weather, and simple starvation. The defenders, meanwhile, sat comfortably behind their walls, often with months or even years of provisions carefully stockpiled in vast storerooms. This logistical asymmetry meant that the besiegers were often on a tighter clock than the besieged, a psychological weight that could cripple a campaign before it began. The fortress's remote location didn't just make attack hard, it made a prolonged attack utterly unsustainable, convincing wise commanders that the entire endeavor was destined to fail from the outset. This brilliant fusion of stone and scenery created a complete defensive system, but its success ultimately relied on the human element waiting within the garrison, whose real and perceived prowess added the final, crucial layer to the illusion of invincibility. Yet the true power of these garrisons lay not merely in their genuine skill, but in the masterful cultivation of their legend. Medieval lords understood the psychology of reputation warfare, recognizing that a carefully crafted narrative could be more formidable than an entire additional regiment of soldiers. They deliberately seeded the countryside with exaggerated tales through trusted agents, traveling merchants, minstrels, even disguised soldiers visiting local taverns. Whispers would spread of a garrison so elite that each man could loose a dozen arrows in the time it took to blink, or of secret tunnels that allowed them to appear behind enemy lines as if by magic. One particularly effective rumor claimed a certain English castle was defended by a company of crossbowmen who never missed, their bolts allegedly blessed by the Archbishop himself to always find their mark. These stories, repeated and embellished with each telling, created a psychological barrier far more imposing than any stone wall. An enemy commander couldn't risk planning an assault based on mere rumor, so he had to assume the worst-case scenario that the legends were true. This theater of readiness was performed with meticulous attention to detail for any potential observers. Garrison commanders would schedule highly visible training drills precisely at times when distant dust clouds might signal the approach of scouts. From a faraway hill, a watching spy would see a seemingly endless stream of helmeted figures patrolling the battlements, never realizing the same 24 men were completing continuous circuits to create the illusion of vastly greater numbers. The rhythmic clang of sword practice and the thunderous synchronized marching of boots on stone were amplified to carry on the wind, a constant auditory reminder of the alertness within. At night, they would light far more watchfires than necessary, creating a constellation of flames that suggested a small army was awake and vigilant while any besieging force tried to sleep in the cold fields below. Every aspect of the garrison's presence was choreographed to project maximum strength and minimum vulnerability. The composition of these forces added another layer to their intimidating reputation. Unlike conscripted peasant levies who might flee at the first sign of real danger, these were often professional men at arms, career soldiers who had chosen military service as their life's work. They were frequently better equipped than their besiegers, sporting polished armor that caught the sunlight and standardized weaponry that spoke of organized supply lines and institutional backing. Their very professionalism was a psychological weapon. An army of part-time soldiers facing such opponents knew they were confronting experts who had spent years mastering the arts of defense and killing. The defenders enjoyed the immense moral advantage of fighting from a position of perfect security, well-rested and well-fed, while attackers faced the grim prospect of assaulting upward against prepared positions manned by fresh, confident professionals who knew every inch of their fortress and had trained for precisely this scenario. This psychological edge often proved decisive before the first arrow ever flew. Perhaps most devastating to enemy morale was the knowledge that these garrisons were prepared for the long game. While besiegers struggled with dwindling supplies, exposed to the elements and disease, the defenders could be seen on the walls enjoying fresh bread from the castle ovens, their water drawn from deep, protected wells, their movements unhurried and confident. The sight of a garrison cooking meat over open fires while the attacking army subsisted on hardtack and thin stew was a powerful demoralizer. Some castle lords would even stage elaborate feasts on the battlements during sieges, a calculated display of abundance designed to taunt the hungry forces below and demonstrate their feudal position. This combination of visible professionalism, psychological warfare, and the spectacle of plenty created an aura of invincibility that frequently broke the will of would-be conquerors, convincing them that the cost of victory would be too high even if achieved. This human element completed the fortress's defensive system, transforming it from a mere structure of stone into a living, breathing entity that projected power through both real capability and carefully manufactured perception, a combination that inevitably forced attackers to consider the sobering economics of prolonged confrontation. Beyond the psychological and human factors, medieval warfare was ultimately governed by a harsh and inescapable economic reality. Commanders weren't just military leaders, they were essentially CEOs of massive, perilous enterprises, and launching a siege against a formidable fortress represented the riskiest investment imaginable. The sheer financial calculus involved could deter aggression more effectively than any wall. Imagine the staggering resources required, feeding thousands of soldiers and their horses for months on end, often in hostile territory far from friendly supply lines. Then came the specialized labor. Skilled carpenters and engineers had to be hired at premium rates to construct towering siege engines like trebuchets and mobile battering rams, each one consuming vast quantities of expensive, seasoned timber. Add to that the payroll for potentially thousands of mercenaries who demanded regular payment in hard coin and would desert immediately if the coffers ran dry. A prolonged siege wasn't a battle. It was a massive, open-ended financial drain that could cripple a kingdom's economy for a generation, all for the uncertain prize of a single castle. This economic imbalance was deliberately engineered by the defenders. While a besieging army strained its logistics to the breaking point, the lords within the fortress often sat atop stockpiles that were nothing short of legendary. Castle storehouses were designed to hold years' worth of grain, salted meat, and dried legumes in vast, cool, dry cellars. Deep, protected wells ensured an endless supply of fresh water, while private breweries and bakeries could operate indefinitely. Some castle lords took this a step further, turning their preparedness into a psychological weapon. They would deliberately invite captured scouts or disguised enemy agents to tour their overflowing granaries and see the herds of livestock kept in inner courtyards. The message was unequivocal: you may run out of food and money long before we ever do. This spectacle of abundance was a masterstroke of economic intimidation, making the prospect of a long siege seem not just difficult, but financially suicidal for the attacker. For a medieval ruler, this created a brutal cost-benefit analysis. Why gamble the entire treasury and risk a peasant revolt over taxes on a multi-year siege of an impregnable fortress like Krak Deschevaliers, when a weaker, less provisioned castle in a neighboring valley offered a quicker, cheaper victory? Military campaigns were often exercises in opportunism. A smart commander would bypass these economic fortresses entirely, choosing instead to raid undefended villages, burn crops, and isolate the stronghold, hoping to force a surrender through indirect economic pressure rather than direct assault. But even this strategy had its limits against a castle that was truly self-sufficient. The existence of these financially ruinous fortresses effectively shaped the map of medieval conflict, channeling armies toward softer targets and creating pockets of stable territory that were simply too expensive to attack. This clever manipulation of medieval economics established a powerful deterrent, but it was a deterrent that would soon face its greatest challenge from a revolution in technology that threatened to make even the strongest walls obsolete. Perhaps the most visually intimidating innovation was the development of machicolations, those stone galleries projecting from the tops of walls and gatehouses. While their practical function was grimly efficient, allowing defenders to drop rocks, pour boiling liquids, or shoot arrows directly down on attackers at the base of the wall, their psychological impact was equally significant. These overhanging stone structures cast deep, shifting shadows across the fortress facade, creating patterns of light and dark that made the walls appear thicker, heavier, and more ominous. To an approaching soldier, these dark openings suggested invisible threats lurking above, from which death could rain down at any moment without warning. The very architecture seemed to bristle with hostile intent, transforming smooth walls into predatory structures that appeared ready to actively strike back against any who dared approach too closely. As warfare evolved with the introduction of gunpowder, fortress architecture faced its greatest challenge yet, and the most successful strongholds turned this threat into yet another psychological advantage. The emergence of cannon ports in the 15th century represented a brilliant adaptation. These were not simple holes in the wall, but carefully designed embrasures thick angled openings that allowed defenders to fire their own cannons outward while providing minimal target for incoming artillery. For an attacking army still transporting older, less reliable gunpowder weapons, the sight of these modern, purpose-built openings sent a clear message. The defenders had not only anticipated the new technology but had mastered it. The fortress was not a relic of the past, it was a modern military installation, already evolved beyond the very weapons brought to assault it. This display of technological adaptation shattered the morale of commanders who had hoped their new cannons would be a decisive advantage. Some castles incorporated engineering marvels that bordered on theatrical deception, designed to create an impression of almost supernatural control over the environment. Advanced water systems represent a fascinating example. While many fortresses had simple moats, the most sophisticated could manipulate water on command. Through hidden sluice gates and clever hydraulics, defenders could rapidly flood dry ditches or low-lying approach areas, transforming seemingly safe ground into impassable waterways within minutes. To a medieval mind, this sudden manipulation of water must have appeared miraculous, as if the castle itself commanded the elements. This ability to alter the very landscape at will created a profound psychological effect, suggesting that the defenders possessed knowledge and powers beyond normal military capability. It made the fortress seem less like a building and more like a living entity with control over nature itself. The cumulative effect of these technological displays was to create an aura of insurmountable sophistication. An attacking force wasn't just facing high walls and determined soldiers, they were confronting what appeared to be the pinnacle of military science. The message communicated was that the defenders were not merely hiding behind ancient stone, but were intelligent, adaptive, and resourceful, always one step ahead technologically. This perception of superiority could paralyze an enemy's decision-making process. Commanders might delay attacks indefinitely while waiting for better technology or more information, fearing that their current methods were already obsolete against such innovation. The technological arms race thus became another form of psychological warfare, where the appearance of advancement could deter conflict just as effectively as actual military superiority. This demonstration of technical prowess across different regions and cultures shows how universal the principles of psychological deterrence had become in fortress design. Rising from the sun-baked hills of Apulia in southern Italy, Castel del Monte presents a mystery that has captivated historians and architects for centuries. Unlike the sprawling, intimidating fortresses we've explored, this structure achieves its psychological impact not through sheer scale or obvious martial features, but through something far more subtle and intellectually disarming: perfect geometric harmony. Built by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in the 1240s, the castle is a masterpiece of octagonal symmetry, with 8 perfectly equal sides and an 8-sided tower at each corner. To the medieval mind, this mathematical precision was deeply unsettling. In an era where most construction was irregular and organic, such flawless geometry suggested knowledge far beyond the ordinary, perhaps even supernatural or divine inspiration. The castle didn't look like it was built by human hands. It appeared to have been calculated into existence, an idea so advanced it bordered on the occult. Frederick II himself was a key part of this psychological equation. Known as Stupor Mundi, or the wonder of the world, he was a Renaissance man centuries before the Renaissance, a multilingual scholar, a patron of science and mathematics, and a ruler deeply fascinated by Arabic and classical learning. His reputation for intellectual brilliance and almost mystical innovation preceded him. An army commander considering an assault on Castel del Monte wasn't just looking at a castle. he was confronting the physical manifestation of one of the most formidable and unpredictable minds in Christendom. What hidden defenses might this scholar emperor have engineered into his geometric marvel? The very absence of traditional features like a moat, a drawbridge, or extensive outer walls was itself psychologically unnerving. It defied all conventional military logic, suggesting that Frederick possessed some revolutionary new principle of defense that made these standard elements obsolete. This deliberate break from tradition created a profound uncertainty in any potential attacker. This uncertainty was amplified by the castle's mysterious and ambiguous purpose. While it's called a castle, Castel del Monte lacks many features of a purely military installation. It has no barracks for housing a large garrison, no stables for war horses, and its elegant, almost palatial interiors seem designed for contemplation and courtly life rather than for withstanding a prolonged siege. This blurring of functions made it a complete enigma. Was it a fortified hunting lodge, a royal retreat, a temple to scientific knowledge, or was it, as some have speculated, a giant astronomical instrument built in stone? For a medieval military planner, this ambiguity was paralyzing. How does one plan a siege against a symbol? How does one gauge the defenses of a building that doesn't even announce itself clearly as a fortress? The risk of miscalculation was simply too great. It was far safer to bypass this puzzling structure altogether than to risk the embarrassment and catastrophic loss of life that might come from assaulting an impregnable enigma. The castle's strategic placement further complicated any potential attack. It sits not on a high, easily defensible mountain peak, but on a gentle, isolated hill, making it highly visible from miles away. This was not a fortress hiding its strength. It was one so confident that it displayed itself openly, a clear declaration of power that needed no topographical crutches. The approach across the open Apulian plains offered little cover for an advancing army, who would be fully exposed during their entire approach, watched from those mathematically precise windows. The local lords and rival armies in the region, familiar with Frederick's formidable reputation and baffled by the castle's design, consistently chose to grant it a wide berth. There are no records of any serious attempt to besiege it, a testament to the potent psychological cocktail of intellectual intimidation, imperial prestige, and mysterious design. Castel del Monte proves that the most effective deterrent can sometimes be not a raised fist, but a raised eyebrow, a challenge so intellectually sophisticated that potential adversaries simply feel unprepared to meet it. This Southern European example of psychological dominance through unconventional means finds a fascinating northern counterpart in a fortress that used a very different kind of intimidation. While the mathematically perfect Castel del Monte baffled enemies with its intellectual sophistication, a very different kind of fortress in the far north employed a far more visceral form of intimidation, sheer, uncompromising mass. Bohus Fortress, the mighty Swedish sentinel guarding the volatile border with Norway, represents the pinnacle of brute force psychological warfare. For over 3 centuries, this colossal stronghold stared across the Goethe River at its Norwegian rivals, its very existence a silent, stone declaration of Swedish resolve. What's truly remarkable is that despite being situated on one of the most contested frontiers in Scandinavia, Bohus never endured a single successful siege or full-scale assault. Its victory was won not on the battlefield, but in the minds of Norwegian military planners, who consistently looked upon its formidable presence and decided that the cost of testing its defenses was simply too high to justify. The foundation of this psychological dominance was its overwhelming physical construction. Unlike castles built from the more common limestone or sandstone, Bohus was hewn from the region's native granite, a rock chosen not for its beauty, but for its brutal, unyielding hardness. Its walls were not merely thick, they were monstrous, with sections at the base stretching to an almost incomprehensible 4 meters of solid stone. To put that into perspective, that's wider than the height of a tall man. In an era of early gunpowder warfare, this was an audacious statement. While other castles were being retrofitted with earthen banks to absorb cannon fire, Bohus's architects seemed to scoff at the new technology, building walls so thick they could theoretically shrug off direct hits from any cannon available in the 16 or 1700s. For an artillery commander across the river, the calculation was demoralizing. Even if he managed to haul his heaviest guns into position, he would likely spend days, perhaps weeks, firing round after round at the same spot on the wall just to make a dent, all while under counterfire from the defenders. The fortress didn't just look strong, it looked mathematically, geologically unconquerable. This raw strength was magnified 100-fold by its brilliant strategic positioning. Bohus was not built on a convenient hilltop. It was constructed on a small, rocky island in the middle of the deep, fast-flowing Goethe River. This was no accident. The river served as a natural, liquid moat that dictated the terms of any potential engagement. An attacking army couldn't simply march up to the gates. They were forced into a logistical nightmare, having to either construct a flotilla of boats for a perilous amphibious assault under fire or attempt to fight their way across one of the narrow, easily defended causeways that connected the island to the mainland. Both options funneled attackers into devastating kill zones where their numerical advantage would be nullified. The geography itself became a co-conspirator in the fortress's psychological campaign, transforming a potential battle into a suicidal bottleneck that no sensible general would willingly send his troops into. Understanding that perception was everything, the Swedish crown invested heavily in maintaining the theater of readiness. Even during extended periods of peace, when the royal treasury might have been tempted to reduce garrison sizes or delay repairs, Bohus was kept in a state of impeccable, visible preparedness. Its cannons were always polished and visible on the ramparts. Its walls were kept clear of vegetation to suggest constant maintenance, and its garrison, though perhaps smaller than it appeared, was always composed of professional, well-drilled soldiers. The message to Norwegian spies and diplomats was crystal clear: we are always watching and we are always ready. This relentless display of vigilance eliminated any hope of catching the fortress in a moment of weakness or complacency. It presented a facade of perpetual, unwavering readiness that made the prospect of a surprise attack seem foolish. The ultimate success of Bohus Fortress is measured not in battles won, but in conflicts that never happened. For centuries, it served as the bedrock of stability along the Scandinavian border. Norwegian ambitions for expansion were consistently tempered by the grim, practical reality of having to overcome this granite behemoth. Invasion plans were revised, campaigns were rerouted, and diplomatic solutions were sought precisely because everyone involved knew that Bohus stood immovably in the way. It became the ultimate stabilizer, a geopolitical constant that forced both sides to negotiate rather than escalate. This Scandinavian titan demonstrates that the most powerful fortress is not necessarily the one that wins the most glorious battles, but the one that, through a combination of brute strength, clever positioning, and masterful psychological presentation, makes those battles unnecessary in the first place. This tangible projection of power through stone and strategy finds its more subtle yet equally powerful counterpart in the use of symbolic architecture and heraldic display. Beyond their formidable physical defenses, the most psychologically potent fortresses waged a sophisticated war of symbols, embedding layers of meaning into their very stone that spoke directly to the medieval mind. This was an architecture of intimidation that operated on a spiritual and heraldic level, designed to overwhelm not just the body, but the soul of any potential adversary. As an approaching army drew near, the first thing to greet them was often not an arrow slit or a murder hole, but a breathtaking tapestry of stone carvings covering every visible surface. Above the main gate, the Lord's coat of arms would be displayed in immense, deeply chiseled relief, a permanent, unmissable declaration of ownership and lineage. Flanking it, mythical beasts like griffins, dragons, and lions stood guard in stone, their mouths agape in silent roars. These weren't mere decorations, they were a calculated psychological projection, suggesting that the castle was protected by forces both ancient and supernatural, that to challenge its walls was to challenge the very order of the universe itself. The strategic placement of religious iconography added an even more profound layer to this psychological defense. Crosses, sculptures of saints, and scenes from the Bible were meticulously carved around entrances and on chapel towers facing the approach. For a medieval soldier, a man living in an age of profound faith, this was a powerful deterrent. Attacking a fortress was one thing. Attacking a fortress that visibly placed itself under divine protection was quite another. It introduced a terrifying spiritual calculus. Would God favor the aggressor or the devout defenders praying within their stone-sanctified walls? This messaging was brilliantly amplified by the use of light itself. In many castles, the chapel was strategically positioned with its stained glass windows facing east to catch the morning sun. To a distant observer, a scout on a far hill or a hesitant commander surveying the fortress at dawn, this created a spectacular effect. The castle would appear to be crowned with a halo of jewel-toned light, as if heaven itself were shining its favor upon the defenders. It was a masterstroke of optical propaganda, transforming a military stronghold into a divinely sanctioned bastion. This manipulation of perception extended to the very scale and shape of the architecture. Some lords, in a practice historians now call architectural bragging, commissioned elements that were intentionally oversized beyond any practical need. A gatehouse might be built to a monstrous, exaggerated scale, its archway so vast that it could accommodate 3 riders abreast when one would suffice. Battlements might be raised to impossible heights, not for a better defensive position, but to make the silhouette of the castle appear more dominant against the skyline. A keep might be given an extra, purely decorative floor to increase its towering presence. The goal was to create an optical illusion of invincibility, to make the fortress feel less like a man-made structure and more like an elemental force of nature. An attacker wouldn't just see a tall wall, he would perceive an insurmountable cliff face. He wouldn't just see a large tower, he would perceive an indomitable mountain peak. This was psychological warfare through pure, overwhelming spectacle. The cumulative effect of this symbolic language was to create a complete narrative of power. Our approaching force wasn't just met with physical barriers, they were confronted with a story carved in stone, a story of ancient lineage, divine favor, and limitless resources. It communicated that the Lord within wasn't merely a local noble with a stronghold. He was a legitimate ruler, blessed by God and protected by myth, whose authority was as solid and permanent as the rock upon which his castle stood. This symbolic weight placed a heavy burden on the conscience and courage of any would-be attacker. To initiate a siege was to rebuff not just a garrison of soldiers, but to challenge a dynasty, defy the heavens, and assault a legend. For many medieval commanders, that was a responsibility too grave to bear, leading them to seek easier, less spiritually fraught targets. This intricate dance of symbolism and power, however, was not solely for wartime. It seamlessly transitioned into the castle's role as the vibrant, beating heart of a peaceful community. The very presence of an unchallenged fortress created a remarkable paradox. These instruments of war became, in times of peace, the very engines of prosperity and cultural flourishing. The psychological security they provided acted as a powerful magnet, drawing people from the surrounding countryside who sought not just protection, but opportunity. Just outside the formidable walls, a bustling marketplace would inevitably take root. This was no haphazard collection of stalls. It was a direct consequence of the castle's unspoken guarantee. Merchants could travel from distant lands, confident that their valuable goods, silks, spices, precious metals were safe from bandits and rival lords under the shadow of those imposing battlements. They knew that any attack on the market was an attack on the lord's authority and his primary source of tax revenue, making it an unthinkable provocation. This safe commercial zone became the economic heartbeat of the region, a place where agricultural surplus from local farms could be traded for manufactured goods and exotic imports, circulating wealth and ideas. This economic stability naturally fostered a cultural renaissance. The wealth generated by secure trade attracted the finest artisans, stonemasons, blacksmiths, glassblowers, and weavers who established permanent workshops in the town or burg that grew around the fortress. Their guilds would often be housed in impressive stone buildings, a testament to the lasting prosperity. Scholars, scribes, and architects found patronage, drawn by the lord's court and the general atmosphere of safety that allowed for contemplation and artistry rather than mere survival. Over generations, this could lead to the establishment of schools, libraries, and even the construction of magnificent cathedrals or churches that rivaled the castle itself in scale and beauty. The fortress, initially a symbol of raw power, gradually became the nucleus of a thriving, sophisticated community whose very existence was a testament to the peace it secured. Beyond commerce and culture, these fortresses evolved into the central nervous systems of medieval administration. Within their thick walls, often in the Great Hall or a dedicated chamber, the lord's officials would dispense justice, settling disputes over land, property, and contracts. This court provided a predictable, orderly system of law that replaced the arbitrary violence of feuds, further reinforcing the lord's legitimacy as a ruler and peacekeeper. Meticulous scribes maintained archives, precise records of land ownership, tax obligations, and legal precedents written on precious parchment and stored in heavy iron-bound chests. The castle became the immutable record keeper of the realm, its authority literally set in stone and ink. The collection of taxes, the raising of levies, and the management of resources all radiated from this administrative hub, making it indispensable to the daily functioning of the entire territory. This deep integration into the economic and social fabric of the region created its own powerful, self-reinforcing form of deterrence. Attacking such a fortress was no longer just a military calculation. It became an act of economic and social suicide. A conquering lord wouldn't merely be seizing a stronghold, he would be destroying the very markets that generated wealth, disrupting the administrative systems that kept order, and scattering the skilled population that made the land valuable. The prize of conquest would be a smoldering ruin and a destitute, resentful populace, a burden rather than an asset. The fortress, by enabling peace and prosperity, had made itself and its community too valuable to destroy. This intricate web of mutual dependence explains why some of these stone sentinels could stand guard for centuries without ever seeing conflict. Their greatest defense ultimately became the vibrant, prosperous world they themselves had made possible outside their walls. Rising from the flat plains of northern Poland like a city of brick and ambition, Malbork Castle stands as a monument to the power of pure, overwhelming scale. Constructed by the Teutonic Knights in the 13th century, This was not merely a fortress. It was the administrative capital and symbolic heart of a militant monastic state, and its design communicated one unshakable message: the resources and resolve of its owners were without limit. The statistics alone are staggering. Over 4 million hand-fired bricks were used in its construction, a number so vast it would have required entire forests to be consumed to fire the kilns, and an army of laborers working for decades. To an approaching army or a visiting diplomat, this sheer volume of material was the first and most potent psychological blow. It suggested a treasury so deep, a manpower pool so endless, and a long-term vision so determined that the very idea of challenging such an institution felt like shouting into a hurricane. This psychological warfare through architecture extended to incredibly sophisticated comforts that must have seemed like sorcery to potential besiegers. While most medieval castles were damp, drafty, and miserable places to endure a winter siege, Malbork was engineered for defender luxury. Beneath the floors of the grand refectory and key defensive positions ran a hypocaust system, an ingenious network of channels through which hot air from great fireplaces would circulate. This meant that the Teutonic knights and their soldiers could stand watch in warm, dry halls, their morale high and their bodies ready, while any foolish army camped outside would be slowly decimated by the bitter Baltic frost, hunger, and disease. The contrast was a devastating demoralizer. The message was clear: the defenders could wait forever in comfort, while the attackers faced a battle against the elements they were guaranteed to lose. The knights masterfully supplemented these physical advantages with a relentless campaign of strategic storytelling. They understood that a myth could be as strong as any wall. Whispers were deliberately spread through the taverns and trading routes of Europe about Malbork's legendary features. There were tales of a network of secret tunnels so extensive that the garrison could appear and disappear at will, or receive supplies even during the tightest encirclement. Other stories spoke of mystical protections, holy relics embedded in the foundations that made the walls impervious to cannon fire, or divine favor that would curse any who raised a sword against the castle. These rumors, impossible to verify, created a cloud of uncertainty and superstition around the fortress. A pragmatic military commander might dismiss such tales, but he could never be entirely sure, and he certainly couldn't convince his common soldiers, who marched under a heavy blanket of superstition, that the stories weren't true. This murky blend of fact and fiction made the castle appear not just strong, but mysteriously and perhaps supernaturally invincible. The result of this brilliant combination of scale, innovation, and propaganda was a perfect record of deterrence. Throughout the height of its power during the Middle Ages, despite the Teutonic Order being embroiled in constant conflict with the Kingdom of Poland and the Duchy of Lithuania, Malbork Castle itself never faced a formal, determined siege. Enemy armies would ravage the countryside, but they would consistently stop short of testing the legend of the Order's great brick fortress. The cost-benefit analysis was too clear. The resources required to even attempt a siege were astronomical, and the probability of success against such a well-provisioned, technologically advanced, and mythically protected stronghold was vanishingly small. Malbork's greatest victory was the silence of its battlements, the absence of scorch marks from Greek fire, the lack of scars from trebuchet impacts, a pristine condition that stands as the ultimate testament to the success of psychological deterrence. This reliance on perceived strength, however, demanded a constant and careful performance of readiness to maintain the illusion, a theatrical display that became an art form in itself. A fortress's true strength wasn't just in its design or garrison, but in the silent, continuous performance of its readiness, a carefully staged theater of vigilance designed to play upon the deepest insecurities of any watching enemy. Medieval lords grasped a fundamental truth of human psychology. A structure that appears flawless and meticulously maintained suggests an institution of immense discipline, bottomless resources, and unwavering attention to detail. This perception of perfect order was itself a powerful deterrent, as it crushed any hope an adversary might harbor of finding a weak link, a neglected corner, or a moment of complacency to exploit. Consequently, they invested enormous sums not just in building these stone giants, but in the endless upkeep that kept them looking perpetually, intimidatingly new. This commitment to immaculate appearance involved a small army of specialized workers whose sole duty was to maintain the facade of perfection. Squads of masons would be constantly visible on the battlements, carefully repointing mortar between stones not just to prevent weathering, but to eliminate any visual suggestion of decay or structural weakness. The most striking element of this maintenance theater was the regular whitewashing of walls. Applying a fresh coat of lime wash did more than just protect the stone, it transformed the castle's visual profile. A brilliantly white fortress shining under the sun was a dazzling declaration of wealth and care, its radiant surface making it appear even larger and more dominant against the landscape. This was no mere paint job, it was a psychological broadcast of vitality and inexhaustible resources. The same meticulous attention was paid to every visible detail. Metal fittings, hinges, portcullis, teeth, and door bands were kept polished to a high gleam, their sharp edges catching the light to signal deadly efficiency. Perhaps most importantly, the heraldic banners flying from the towers were treated as perishable commodities, replaced with dazzling new flags long before the sun and wind could fade their vibrant colors. A faded, tattered banner whispered of poverty and neglect, a signal to enemies that the Lord's attention might be elsewhere. Pristine, snapping flags in bold colors, however, proclaimed a leader who was present, engaged, and investing heavily in his stronghold's symbolic power. The performance extended to timing and audience. Garrison commanders knew that enemy scouts would be constantly observing from distant tree lines or hills, and they scheduled their most visible maintenance activities accordingly. The deliberate clang of a blacksmith's hammer reshaping a weapon or the sight of teams hauling fresh timber into the gates during broad daylight were not coincidences, they were staged demonstrations. The message to any hidden observer was clear: our forges are active, our supplies are plentiful, and our workforce is unafraid and operating in the open because we have absolutely nothing to fear from you. This calculated display of normalcy under presumed surveillance was a masterclass in psychological pressure, designed to make any potential attacker feel like their every move was anticipated and rendered irrelevant. This relentless theater of readiness created a powerful, self-reinforcing illusion of a fortress that was not just strong, but alert, adaptive, and eternally prepared. It forced enemy commanders into a paralyzing state of doubt. If the walls were always perfect, how could their siege engines find a weak point? If the banners were always new, how could they be sure the garrison wasn't at full strength? If work continued unabated under their very noses, how could they ever hope to achieve surprise? This cultivated image of flawless readiness often made the difference between a castle that was tested and one that was left entirely alone, proving that in the game of deterrence, the appearance of strength could be just as decisive as strength itself. This intricate dance of visual deception seamlessly connects to an even more subtle art form, the control of information itself. This shadow war of information was waged not in the open field, but in the bustling market squares, smoky taverns, and shadowy corridors of power where whispers held more sway than swords. Medieval rulers were masters of this dark art, understanding that the most potent weapons in their arsenal were often carefully crafted lies and deliberately staged illusions. They recognized that a fortress's true strength was a combination of its stone walls and the stories told about it, and they went to extraordinary lengths to control that narrative. The goal was simple yet brilliant: to inflate the perceived cost of an attack so dramatically in the enemy's mind that they would abandon the venture long before a single soldier ever marched. The primary channels for this disinformation campaign were the era's natural news networks, traveling merchants, pilgrims, and minstrels. These individuals moved freely across borders, their packs and songs carrying not just goods and entertainment, but state-sponsored gossip. A lord's agent, posing as a simple soldier in a tavern, might casually complain to a merchant from a rival territory about the backbreaking work of hauling endless sacks of grain into the castle's storerooms, sacks that were, in reality, filled with sand. Another might drunkenly boast of a new shipment of crossbows so powerful they could punch through the finest armor at 300 paces, a claim entirely invented. These seeds of deception, planted in fertile soil, would blossom into full-fledged legends by the time they reached the ears of a rival duke or king, creating an inflated picture of impossible logistical readiness and terrifying military technology. The deception extended far beyond whispered words into elaborate, costly theatrical productions designed for an audience of enemy spies. Knowing their fortresses were under constant observation from distant hills and hidden watchers, lords would stage spectacular displays of false strength. They might order their garrison to march in and out of the main gate repeatedly throughout a single day, using the same group of men but changing their helmets and cloaks each time to create the illusion of a vast, rotating army within. Siege engines might be constructed from painted canvas and wood, propped up on the battlements to suggest a defensive capability far beyond the truth. The most cunning rulers even fabricated the signs of an impending offensive, having their blacksmiths work through the night with orders to make as much noise as possible, or having cooks prepare enough rations for a campaign and then openly distributing them, only to quietly recall them the next day. The message to any observer was clear: we are not merely prepared to defend, we are bursting with men and material, and we are on the verge of striking out ourselves. Perhaps the most psychologically potent rumors were those that tapped into the deep well of medieval superstition and religious fervor. In an age where faith and fear were intertwined, a well-placed story could be more effective than 1,000 archers. Spies might report that a mysterious plague had broken out within the castle walls, a divine punishment that also served as a terrifying biological deterrent to any would-be besieger. More creatively, lords might circulate tales that their fortress was under the direct protection of a particular saint, their relic embedded in the foundation stone, making the walls impervious to harm. Others claimed their court magician or a benevolent hermit had enchanted the moat to boil on command, or had summoned protective spirits to guard the battlements. For a common soldier, the prospect of facing a well-armed garrison was daunting enough. The idea of also battling unseen mystical forces could shatter morale completely. This sophisticated manipulation of information created a fog of war long before the fighting ever started, clouding enemy judgment and protecting the realm through clever deception rather than costly bloodshed. On the windswept coast of Anglesey in Wales stands Beaumaris Castle, a structure so perfectly conceived by its builders that it has been called the most technically sophisticated castle in all of Britain. Its story is not one of epic sieges or valiant last stands, but something far more remarkable, a legacy of absolute peace enforced by its mere existence. Built by King Edward I of England during his campaign to subdue Wales, Beaumaris was the final and most expensive link in his iron ring of fortresses. Yet despite being constructed in a region of fierce and frequent rebellion, its pristine walls and unmarked battlements tell a silent tale. It never once faced a serious assault. Its power was not in its ability to win a war, but in its genius for making war seem utterly unwinnable for any who might consider it. The secret to this psychological dominance lies in its revolutionary concentric design, taken to its logical and most terrifying extreme. Imagine not one, but two complete, independent rings of formidable defenses, one nested perfectly inside the other. The outer curtain wall is a low, thick barrier, studded with 16 towers and punctuated by two mighty gatehouses. But breaching this outer shell would not grant an attacker access to the heart of the castle. Instead, it would funnel them into a deadly killing zone, a narrow corridor of death completely exposed to the even higher and stronger inner wall. From this inner ring, defenders could unleash a constant, merciless hail of arrows, stones, and boiling liquid from every conceivable angle. There were no blind spots, no safe approaches. The entire design was a mathematical equation for slaughter, a puzzle that contemporary military planners looked upon and decided was simply not worth solving. What makes Beaumaris particularly fascinating is that it was built at a time when siege technology was rapidly evolving. The trebuchet had reached its peak of power, and early gunpowder weapons were beginning to appear on battlefields. Yet, the architects of Beaumaris seemed to anticipate and counter every new development. The towers were rounded to better deflect the impact of stone shots, and the walls were arranged to provide overlapping fields of fire for archers and, potentially, early cannon. For a Welsh commander surveying the site, the message was clear. This was not an old-fashioned stronghold. It was a modern military complex, already adapted to the latest weapons and tactics. Attacking it would not be a test of courage, but a futile exercise in obsolescence. Understanding that the castle's fearsome reputation was its primary weapon, the English crown went to great lengths to maintain the theatre of readiness. Even during periods of relative calm and financial strain, the garrison at Beaumaris was kept at or near full strength. The sight of well-equipped professional English men at arms constantly drilling on the pristine battlements was a calculated display of power and permanence directed at the local Welsh population. The king's officials made sure that rumors of the castle's vast stockpiles of food and ammunition were widely circulated. The goal was to make any thought of rebellion seem pointless before it even began. Why risk everything on a doomed assault against this masterpiece of defense when other, less final forms of resistance were available? Beaumaris became the ultimate symbol of English imperial control, its unassailable presence a constant, silent deterrent that kept the peace for centuries through the powerful psychology of perceived invincibility. Yet for all their success, the strategy of winning wars without fighting was never foolproof. History provides us with sobering examples where formidable fortresses, despite their intimidating appearance and fearsome reputation, ultimately fell. These failures offer crucial lessons about the delicate balance between perception and reality in the art of deterrence. In some cases, ambitious commanders simply refused to be intimidated, choosing to test defenses that others considered invincible. They understood that a castle's psychological power depended entirely on its unchallenged status. Once an army actually began siege operations, the illusion of impregnability could quickly shatter if the reality beneath the surface failed to match the magnificent facade. One critical vulnerability lay in the human element within those mighty walls. A fortress might appear flawless from the outside, but if its garrison was under strength, poorly supplied, or suffering from low morale, its defensive capabilities were fundamentally compromised. Attackers sometimes gained intelligence about these internal weaknesses through spies or deserters, learning that the castle's fearsome reputation was built on a foundation of sand. There are accounts of besiegers discovering that the vast garrison consisted of barely a few dozen men, or that the years of supplies were actually dwindling rations that would last only weeks. When the reality failed to match the carefully cultivated legend, the psychological advantage evaporated instantly, and the fortress became vulnerable to determined assault. Cultural differences and military traditions also created dangerous miscalculations in how intimidation was perceived. What one culture considered a clear signal of invincibility, another might interpret as a challenge to be met. The elaborate symbolic decorations that European knights believed demonstrated divine favor and legitimate authority might appear as arrogant boasting to opposing forces with different value systems. Some warrior cultures placed such high value on courage and honor that attacking the most formidable fortress available became a way to gain prestige, rather than something to be avoided. This cross-cultural misunderstanding of psychological signals could lead to assaults that more pragmatic commanders would have considered suicidal, sometimes with surprisingly successful results when the attacker's sheer determination overwhelmed the defender's expectations. The most dramatic failures of fortress deterrence came from technological disruption. For centuries, high, thick stone walls had represented the pinnacle of defensive security, creating an almost unbreakable stalemate between besieger and besieged. This equilibrium was shattered by the development of effective gunpowder artillery. The same towering walls that had defied trebuchets and battering rams for generations could now be systematically broken down by sustained cannon fire. Fortresses that had maintained peace through intimidation for decades suddenly found themselves vulnerable to commanders willing to invest in the new technology. The very features that had made them appear so formidable, their immense scale, their static nature, their investment in traditional defenses, now made them perfect targets for the new artillery, which could pound the same spot on a wall repeatedly until it crumbled. This technological revolution forced a complete reconsideration of fortress design and demonstrated that psychological deterrence had to evolve alongside military technology to remain effective. These historical exceptions teach us that successful deterrence could never rely on appearance alone. It required a perfect alignment of physical strength, human readiness, cultural understanding, and technological relevance. A fortress that neglected any of these elements risked becoming a magnificent stage set impressive to look at but hollow at its core. The most effectively intimidating strongholds were those where the reality of their defensive capabilities actually exceeded their fearsome reputation, creating a margin of safety that allowed for the inevitable exaggerations and myths that formed their psychological armor. This delicate balance between perception and capability explains why the greatest fortress builders paid as much attention to their granaries, their garrisons' training, and their intelligence networks as they did to their battlements and towers. Guarding the entrance to Helsinki's harbor, the fortress of Suamenlina represents a fascinating evolution in the psychology of military deterrence, seamlessly transitioning from medieval principles into the early modern era. Constructed in the mid-1700s by the Swedish crown on a cluster of interconnected islands, this sprawling defensive complex was designed to project power through scale and sophistication rather than through frequent combat. Its strategic genius lay in its conceptual shift from a single fortified point to an entire defensive ecosystem, a network of bastions, redoubts, and cannon batteries spread across 6 islands, creating the impression of an indomitable, multi-layered barrier that would require a massive coordinated naval assault to overcome. This was intimidation through architectural sprawl, sending a clear message to any admiral considering an attack. breaching this defense would demand resources and losses far exceeding any potential gain. The fortress masterfully blended cutting-edge military technology with timeless psychological principles. Its designers incorporated the latest advances in star fort geometry and artillery placement, with low, thick walls designed to absorb cannon fire and angled bastions providing overlapping fields of fire across every approach channel. Yet simultaneously, they maintained the medieval emphasis on overwhelming visual impact. The sheer scale of construction across the islands created an imposing silhouette against the horizon, a man-made mountain range of fortification that dominated the seascape. The strategic positioning was equally brilliant, controlling the narrow entrance to Helsinki's natural harbor while forcing any attacking fleet to navigate treacherous, winding channels under the guns of multiple island fortifications simultaneously. This combination of modern engineering and psychological calculation made direct assault appear not just difficult, but practically suicidal. Historical records from both the Swedish and Russian naval commands reveal how effectively this psychological deterrence worked in practice. During the numerous conflicts that swept across the Baltic region in the 18th and 19th centuries, military planners consistently judged Suamenlina too formidable to attack directly. Russian admirals, despite possessing powerful fleets, chose instead to bypass the fortress entirely during campaigns, preferring to land troops elsewhere or negotiate around its defensive umbrella. The calculus was straightforward. The resources required for a successful siege, dozens of warships, thousands of soldiers, and months of supply lines, were simply too great to justify when diplomatic solutions or attacks on less fortified targets offered better returns. The fortress achieved its ultimate purpose not by winning battles, but by preventing them altogether, becoming a stabilizing presence that shaped military strategy through implied threat rather than actual violence. This remarkable preservation through deterrence is why Suamenlina stands today as one of the best preserved historical fortifications in the world, earning its designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Unlike castles that were repeatedly modified after suffering damage in sieges, Suamenlina's structures remain largely in their original condition, offering archaeologists and historians a pristine example of 18th-century military architecture. Its untouched state serves as permanent testament to its historical success. The cannons never fired in anger, the walls never breached by assault, the garrison never tested in prolonged combat. The fortress won its peace not through destruction, but through the brilliant application of psychological intimidation, proving that the principles of deterrence so effectively employed by medieval builders remained equally potent in the age of sail and cannon. Suamenlina's story provides a crucial bridge between the medieval world of castle-based deterrence and the modern concepts of military psychology that would follow. It demonstrates how the fundamental principles of psychological defense, overwhelming scale, strategic positioning, technological demonstration, and the manipulation of risk assessment transcend specific historical periods and military technologies. The fortress represents a key evolutionary step where the intuitive understanding of intimidation that guided medieval architects began transforming into the more systematic, calculated approach to deterrence that would characterize modern military strategy. This seamless continuity from the age of stone walls to the age of gunpowder fortifications shows that regardless of the technology involved, the human psychology of conflict avoidance remains remarkably consistent, setting the stage for understanding how these ancient principles continue to operate in our contemporary world. The stone sentinels of the medieval world may seem distant from our digital age, but the psychological principles they mastered are more relevant than ever, operating silently in the corridors of modern power. Consider the most dramatic parallel: nuclear deterrence. Much like a fortress whose very presence dictated campaign maps, nuclear arsenals are weapons designed explicitly to never be used. Their power lies not in their deployment, but in the unimaginable, mutually assured destruction they promise. This creates a terrifying stalemate, a global version of two rival lords looking up at each other's impregnable castles and deciding, generation after generation, that the cost of attack is simply too high to contemplate. The doctrine is pure medieval psychology scaled to a planetary level, projecting such an overwhelming threat that it prevents conflict altogether, making the world paradoxically stable through the balance of ultimate fear. This architecture of intimidation has also found a new home in the corporate world. The soaring glass and steel skyscrapers that house modern multinational companies are the new century's fortified keeps. Their design is rarely just about maximizing office space. It's a calculated statement of permanence, wealth, and invulnerability aimed at competitors, investors, and the market itself. The immense cost of such headquarters communicates bottomless resources, while the imposing, often fortress-like aesthetics suggest a company that is unassailable and built to endure any economic siege. Just as a medieval merchant felt safe trading in the shadow of a mighty castle, investors feel a sense of security seeing their capital housed in such a monument to corporate power. The building itself becomes a silent, powerful actor in the psychological warfare of global business. In our most personal space, the digital realm, we see these ancient strategies playing out every day. Cybersecurity operates on a foundation of layered deterrence that any medieval castle architect would recognize. The goal isn't to create an absolutely unbreachable system, an impossible task, but to make the effort required to breach it so complex, costly, and time-consuming that most potential attackers simply give up and look for an easier target. Firewalls, multi-factor authentication, and complex encryption are the digital equivalents of multi-layered curtain walls, deep moats, and imposing gatehouses. They create a perception of formidable difficulty, a psychological barrier that discourages all but the most determined and well-resourced adversaries. We protect our data not just with code, but with the implied message of the effort required to break it. Even in everyday life, we employ miniature versions of these strategies. A home security system sign planted in a front yard, a monitored alarm sticker on a car window, these are the modern equivalent of a lord flying his banners from the battlements. Their effectiveness often has less to do with the actual technology behind them, and everything to do with the psychological signal they send to a potential intruder. This target is prepared. This target will be more trouble than it's worth. Move along to something easier. This understanding connects us directly to the medieval mind, revealing a timeless human truth about conflict avoidance. It shows that across centuries, the most effective defense has often been a cleverly constructed illusion of strength, a performance of readiness that persuades an adversary to choose a different path, saving everyone the terrible cost of a real confrontation. The pristine condition of these never-besieged fortresses offers archaeologists a rare and invaluable window into the medieval world, untouched by the ravages of combat and the chaotic modifications of emergency repairs. Unlike castles scarred by repeated battles, where archaeologists must sift through layers of destruction, reconstruction, and hasty adaptations, sites like Beaumaris or Castel del Monte present themselves almost exactly as their original builders intended. This allows for an unprecedented study of sophisticated construction techniques in their ideal state. Researchers can examine the precise stonework of a defensive wall without the confusion of later patches, observe the original slope and composition of a glacis that was never tested by a siege tower, and map out arrow slit placements that were designed for optimal coverage but never used in anger. The mortar between the stones, crucial for dating and understanding construction phases, remains uncontaminated by later repairs, allowing for precise chemical analysis that reveals not just the age of the structure, but the sources of its materials and the technological knowledge of its builders. This lack of damage provides a clear view into the theoretical ideals of medieval military architecture. We aren't seeing a castle as it was forced to become under the desperate pressure of attack. We are seeing the pure, uncompromised vision of its architects. At Krak Deschevaliers, for instance, archaeologists can study the perfect geometry of its concentric walls precisely as designed, without the distortions of breached sections or the additions of emergency barricades. They can analyze the sophisticated drainage systems, hypocausts like those at Malbork, and water storage solutions that were engineered for long-term comfort and endurance, systems that often suffered the most in a prolonged siege. This allows historians to distinguish between the grand ambitions of defensive theory and the often messy reality of medieval warfare, providing a benchmark against which battle-damaged castles can be compared. We learn not just how castles were adapted to survive, but how they were meant to function at their absolute best. The everyday lives of the garrison and inhabitants are also revealed with remarkable clarity. In a besieged castle, the evidence of daily life is often obliterated by the debris of conflict or the desperate consumption of all resources. In these peaceful fortresses, however, Midden's ancient garbage dumps contain undisturbed layers of animal bones, pottery fragments, and personal items that tell a detailed story of diet, trade, and domestic routine. The absence of weapon fragments or projectile points in these layers is itself a powerful data point, confirming the quiet history of the site. Analysis of soil samples from courtyards and storage areas can reveal what crops were grown, what animals were kept, and how the castle functioned as a self-sufficient economic unit, all evidence that tends to be wiped away by the trampling feet of an attacking army and the urgent needs of defense. This archaeological purity extends to the very materials themselves. The stonework, iron fittings, and wooden beams retain their original properties, unaffected by the intense heat of fires set during an assault or the structural stress of bombardment. This allows for cutting-edge scientific techniques like spectrometry to accurately source the origin of stones, revealing vast medieval trade networks for specific types of building materials. Analysis of metal alloys in door fittings and portcullises shows the period's metallurgical capabilities when not constrained by the need for rapid wartime production. Each of these undisturbed sites acts as a perfectly preserved time capsule, offering a level of detail about medieval engineering, logistics, and daily life that is simply unattainable from sites with more violent histories. The silent, unmarked stones of these fortresses speak volumes to those who know how to listen, providing a uniquely clear narrative of architectural ambition and peaceful occupation that forever changes our understanding of the medieval past. Perhaps the most profound legacy of these peaceful fortresses was the cultural flourishing they made possible. In the shadow of their unbreached walls, something remarkable could take root that was nearly impossible in war-torn regions: sustained creative and intellectual progress. With a constant threat of invasion removed, the tremendous resources that would have been consumed by warfare, both in terms of material and human capital, could be redirected toward more productive endeavors. Skilled stonemasons who might have spent their careers repairing battle damage could instead turn their talents to crafting magnificent cathedrals with intricate facades and soaring vaulted ceilings. Artists and scribes, no longer fearing their work would be destroyed in the next raid, could undertake ambitious projects like illuminated manuscripts that required years of painstaking labor, knowing their efforts would endure for generations. This cultural security created the conditions for distinctive regional artistic styles to develop and mature, giving us the breathtaking Gothic architecture of France, the unique brick Gothic of the Baltic region, and the Moorish-influenced designs of Spain, each a testament to prolonged periods of stability underwritten by psychological deterrence. The economic transformation was equally dramatic, as the guaranteed safety provided by these unchallenged fortresses acted as a powerful catalyst for commercial development. Major trade routes naturally gravitated toward these zones of stability, where merchants could transport valuable goods without the constant fear of ambush or confiscation by marauding armies. The famous Champagne fairs in medieval France, which became the commercial crossroads of Europe, flourished precisely because they were protected by a network of formidable castles that kept the region secure from the conflicts raging elsewhere. This security allowed for the emergence of sophisticated financial instruments and banking practices, as merchants could extend credit and make long-term investments without fearing that war would destroy their debtors or disrupt their trade networks. The economic prosperity generated by this stability in turn reinforced the power of the local lords, creating a virtuous cycle where peace generated wealth, and wealth funded the maintenance of the very fortresses that guaranteed that peace. This environment of stability also fostered remarkable innovations in governance and law. Regions blessed with prolonged peace could develop complex legal systems and administrative structures that were simply impractical in territories constantly disrupted by warfare. The famous Magna Carta, while born from conflict, could only take root and evolve into a lasting tradition of limited government because England possessed a relative degree of stability protected by its network of royal castles. In Italy, city-states protected by formidable fortifications developed revolutionary models of republican governance and civic identity that might never have emerged under constant military threat. These political innovations demonstrate how psychological security created space for social experimentation, allowing communities to develop more sophisticated systems of justice, representation, and administration that would eventually influence the modern world. The intellectual atmosphere in these protected territories was equally transformative. The great medieval universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and Paris all emerged in regions that enjoyed unusual stability, often guaranteed by nearby royal fortresses or powerful ecclesiastical authorities. Scholars could pursue years of study without interruption, libraries could accumulate and preserve knowledge across generations, and ideas could be debated and refined without the constant disruption of fleeing invaders or seeking shelter. This intellectual continuity allowed for the preservation of classical knowledge through the Islamic world into Europe and laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution that would follow. The very concept of academic freedom and the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake depended on the physical and psychological security provided by these bastions of stability. Perhaps most importantly, these fortresses enabled the development of what we might call cultural confidence, the sense that a community's way of life, its traditions, its architecture, and its values were permanent and worth preserving. In frequently contested border regions, culture tends to become pragmatic and transient, constantly adapting to changing rulers and threats. But in the heartlands protected by these formidable deterrents, cultures could develop deep roots, distinctive characteristics, and a sense of historical continuity. This cultural confidence manifested in everything from distinctive regional cuisines and folk traditions to architectural styles and literary movements, each reflecting centuries of uninterrupted development rather than the cultural layer cake that emerges from repeatedly conquered territories. This broader perspective reveals that the true measure of these fortresses' success wasn't in their military victories, but in the civilizations they made possible. Their greatest triumph was the silence of their battlements, the absence of scorch marks, the lack of siege damage, the pristine condition that speaks of peace preserved rather than war won. They stand as monuments to a sophisticated understanding that true power lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to create conditions where destruction becomes unthinkable. This cultural and economic legacy, written not in blood but in stone, art, law, and learning, represents perhaps the most enduring achievement of medieval strategic thinking, a testament to the idea that the ultimate purpose of military strength is to make itself unnecessary. Perched dramatically atop a rocky crag where two rivers meet, the Alcazar of Segovia presents one of the most unforgettable silhouettes in all of medieval architecture, a stone ship forever sailing against the skyline. Its unique, prow-like bow and soaring towers give it the appearance of a vessel carved from the very bedrock, an impression so striking that it transcends mere fortification to become something closer to a natural wonder. This breathtaking visual spectacle was its first and most powerful line of defense. For any army approaching the plains of Castile, the sight of this majestic fortress palace, seemingly both part of the cliff and defying it, created an immediate psychological barrier. It didn't just look strong, it looked inevitable, as if it had been ordained by the landscape itself to stand guard for all time, making the very notion of mounting an assault feel both sacrilegious and utterly futile. The Alcazar's genius lies in its masterful synthesis of two powerful architectural traditions, creating a hybrid design that communicated sophisticated cultural and military prowess. The deep horseshoe arches, intricate plasterwork, and serene courtyards reflect its Moorish influences, speaking to a legacy of Al-Andalus craftsmanship and mathematical precision in design. Yet these are seamlessly woven together with robust Romanesque towers, Gothic hallways, and the heraldic emblems of Christian kings. This wasn't a clumsy juxtaposition but a brilliant fusion, suggesting a ruling class that was both culturally enlightened and formidably pragmatic. To a potential adversary, this architectural harmony sent a clear message. The rulers within were not provincial warlords but sophisticated players on a European stage, capable of harnessing the best ideas from diverse cultures to create something entirely new and advanced. An attack on the Alcazar wasn't just an attack on a castle. It was an assault on a symbol of a rising, unified, and intellectually formidable Spain. Strategically, its position was a masterstroke of economic and military calculus. The fortress commands the crucial pass through the Sierra de Guadarrama Mountains, controlling the main road connecting the northern kingdoms to the vital cultural and economic centers of central Spain. This meant it watched over the flow of wealth, silver, wool, and merchandise, making it an incredibly valuable prize. Yet, this very value was protected by its intimidating presence. Attacking such a well-defended position to control the trade route would have been a paradox. The cost of the siege in men, money, and time would have devastated the local economy and destroyed the very prosperity an invader hoped to capture. The Alcazar made itself too expensive to attack, transforming its economic significance from a vulnerability into a key component of its defense. Rival armies consistently calculated that it was far wiser to pay tariffs and enjoy continued access to the route than to risk everything on a costly and uncertain siege. While its military credentials were impeccable, complete with a deep moat, a formidable keep, and strategically placed arrow slits, the Alcazar's primary role was as a royal residence and a potent stage for symbolic power. Spanish monarchs understood that authority was projected not just through force, but through spectacle and legitimacy. They hosted lavish courts within its halls, receiving ambassadors and nobles under ceilings adorned with exquisite mudéjar art, demonstrating their wealth and refinement. The castle itself became a character in the theater of statecraft, Its sheer beauty and grandeur were constant reminders of the monarchy's divine right to rule and their commitment to a glorious, prosperous future for Spain. This dual identity as both a luxurious palace and an impregnable fortress created a powerful aura of permanence and legitimacy. It was the undeniable heart of Castilian power, a place so central to the identity of the kingdom that challenging it seemed tantamount to challenging the concept of Spain itself. Today, the Alcazar's pristine preservation allows us to fully appreciate this perfect marriage of form and function. Unlike castles repeatedly modified for war, its elegant halls, royal apartments, and intricate chapels remain untouched by the scars of battle, telling a complete story of peaceful power projection. It stands as the ultimate testament to the idea that the most effective deterrent could be a masterpiece, proving that awe and beauty could be just as formidable as any wall or weapon. This final example brings our journey to a profound close, demonstrating that the pinnacle of medieval defensive strategy was not achieved through brute force alone, but through the brilliant, multifaceted art of architectural psychology. These silent stone giants represent one of history's most sophisticated forms of diplomacy, where architecture communicated what would otherwise require thousands of lives and rivers of blood to establish. The very act of constructing such a formidable fortress was in itself a powerful diplomatic message, carved not on parchment but in tons of masonry and mortar. When a medieval ruler committed the enormous resources required to build a castle like Malbork or Krak Deschevaliers, they weren't just creating a military installation, they were sending an unambiguous declaration to their neighbors and rivals. This declaration stated with absolute clarity, "This land is mine, I value it immensely, I have the wealth and will to defend it, and any attempt to take it will cost you more than you could possibly gain." This architectural statement created a framework for negotiation and stable borders that might otherwise have required generations of warfare to establish. This form of stone diplomacy created a fascinating paradox. By demonstrating an overwhelming capacity for war, these fortresses made actual warfare less likely. Neighboring rulers, faced with the prospect of besieging such a stronghold, would naturally seek diplomatic solutions instead. Why risk your army, your treasury, and your political standing on a costly siege when you could send diplomats to negotiate borders, trade agreements, and mutual protection pacts? The fortress became a fixed point in geopolitical calculations, an undeniable reality that shaped treaties and alliances for centuries. The famous Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which established the modern concept of sovereign states and borders, was built upon centuries of this kind of architectural diplomacy, where fortified lines gradually evolved into accepted boundaries between powers. The resources required for these constructions spoke volumes about a ruler's economic strength and long-term vision. To quarry the stone, transport it, hire skilled masons, and maintain a garrison represented an investment that could bankrupt lesser principalities. When a lord like Edward I of England built his iron ring of castles in Wales, he wasn't just conquering territory, he was demonstrating that the English crown possessed nearly limitless resources and the administrative capability to manage complex projects across great distances. This display of economic and organizational power was perhaps more intimidating than any army, as it suggested that the ruler could sustain a conflict indefinitely, outlasting any rival who might challenge them. The fortress stood as permanent proof of this capability, its very stones counting like coins in a treasury that never emptied. This architectural statecraft required a sophisticated understanding of perception and messaging that we would recognize today as strategic communication. The placement of a fortress was carefully calculated to maximize its psychological impact on the intended audience. A castle built right on a contested border sent a very different message than one constructed deep within secure territory. The choice of architectural style could communicate alignment with certain cultural traditions or rejection of others. Even the speed of construction sent a message. A fortress raised with astonishing speed demonstrated not just resources but incredible organizational efficiency that would give any potential adversary pause. Every aspect of the building process became part of the diplomatic dialogue between powers. The success of this stone diplomacy can be measured in the lasting stability it created across Europe. Regions protected by these unchallenged fortresses experienced longer periods of peace, which in turn allowed for the development of distinctive legal systems, cultural traditions, and economic networks that might have been impossible under constant warfare. The very concept of stable borders, which we take for granted today, emerged gradually from this landscape of mutually recognized fortifications that defined spheres of influence and control. These castles became the anchors around which modern nation-states would eventually coalesce, their presence creating facts on the ground that diplomacy and treaties would later formalize. In this way, the silent diplomacy of stone laid the foundation for the political world we inhabit today, proving that sometimes the most powerful negotiations are conducted not with words but with walls. These silent stone giants teach us a profound historical lesson that the most brilliant victories are often the ones history never records, because they were won before the first sword was ever drawn. The true measure of their success lies not in glorious battle accounts, but in the absence of such stories, in the quiet centuries of stability they preserved through sheer psychological dominance. These fortresses represent the pinnacle of medieval strategic thinking precisely because their architects understood a fundamental truth about human nature. We are often deterred more by what we believe to be true than by what actually is. The carefully cultivated illusion of impregnability became a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating peace through the promise of overwhelming retaliation. This legacy of prevention over conflict echoes through modern military strategy in ways that would feel familiar to any medieval lord. The concept of nuclear deterrence follows precisely the same psychological principle, weapons so terrifying they theoretically prevent their own use through the threat of mutual destruction. Just as rival kingdoms looked upon Krak Deschevaliers and calculated the cost of assault as too high, nuclear powers engage in a delicate dance of posturing and positioning designed to avoid direct confrontation. The underlying human psychology remains unchanged across the centuries. We are still building fortresses, they just take different forms and operate on a global scale. Beyond warfare, these principles of psychological deterrence permeate our daily lives in fascinating ways. The home security system sign planted in a front yard, the monitored alarm sticker on a car window, these are our modern equivalents of flying banners from the battlements. Their effectiveness often has less to do with the actual technology behind them, and everything to do with the signal they send to potential intruders. In the digital realm, complex password requirements and two-factor authentication create psychological barriers that discourage casual hackers, much like a formidable gatehouse discouraged casual raiders. We protect our data not just with code, but with the implied message of the effort required to breach our defenses. The corporate world has also mastered this ancient art of impression management. The soaring glass and steel headquarters of modern technology companies function as contemporary castles, projecting an image of invincibility and permanence to competitors, investors, and the market itself. Their architectural grandeur communicates financial stability and relentless innovation, creating a psychological moat that makes challengers think twice before entering their domain. Just as medieval merchants felt secure trading in the shadow of a mighty fortress, investors feel confidence placing their capital with companies housed in such monuments to corporate power. Perhaps most importantly, these never-besieged fortresses remind us that true strength often lies in restraint, in building capabilities so formidable that you never need to demonstrate them. This wisdom applies to personal conflicts, professional challenges, and international relations alike. The most effective leaders throughout history have understood that the ability to prevent conflict requires greater wisdom and strategic thinking than the ability to win battles. These stone sentinels stand as permanent monuments to this sophisticated understanding of power, their pristine walls bearing witness to generations of peace they made possible through the simple, brilliant strategy of making attack seem futile. If this journey through the psychology of architectural intimidation has sparked your curiosity about how perception shapes reality across history, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What modern examples of psychological deterrence have you noticed in your own life? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of history's hidden strategies and forgotten wisdom. Thank you for joining us as we uncovered the fascinating stories of fortresses that won their wars without ever drawing their